Sometimes life gives a man one last chance when he least expects it. For Ezra Stone, that chance came in the form of a cabin nobody else wanted in the Colorado mountains of 1882. The weathered structure sat on worthless land, miles from decent water or fertile soil. Local folks said it was cursed, built over bad ground. Ezra didn't believe in curses, just hard work and making do with what you have. As he cleared the overgrown property, he found an old stone well, sealed shut with heavy planks. The previous owner had covered it up, as if hiding something. When Ezra pried those boards loose and looked down into the darkness, what he saw glittering below would either make him rich or get him killed. Every fortune hunter in 3 territories would soon be hunting him. But what secret did the cabin's owner take to his grave? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across the Colorado Territory as Ezra Stone stood before the cabin that would change his life forever. At 53, he carried himself with the steady bearing of a man who had seen both war and peace, triumph and devastating loss. His weathered hands, scarred from countless battles with both enemies and elements, traced the rough-hewn logs of the structure's walls. This place represented something he hadn't dared hope for in years, a chance to start over. Ezra's story was written in the lines of his face and the careful way he moved through the world. He had been a different man once, a husband and father with a small farm in Kansas. That was before the fever took his wife Sarah and their 2 children in the brutal winter of 78. Before grief drove him west into the mountains, where a man could lose himself among the peaks and pines, where the silence was so complete it felt like sanctuary. For 4 years, he had lived like a ghost among the high country, trapping, hunting, trading his pelts for supplies in whatever settlement he could reach before the snows came. He knew every ridge and valley for 50 miles, every stream that ran clean, and every cave that offered shelter from the storms. The mountains had become his cathedral, vast and indifferent, demanding nothing but survival and offering nothing but the hard peace that comes from absolute solitude. But solitude, Ezra had learned, was both medicine and poison. It healed the raw wounds of loss, but left a man hollow in places that once held warmth. At night, when the wind howled through the peaks like the voices of the dead, he would pull out his worn leather Bible, the only remnant of his former life he had carried into the wilderness. Between its pages, pressed like precious memories, were wildflowers Sarah had picked on their wedding day and a faded photograph of his children, Emma and little James, taken just months before the fever claimed them. The Bible was more than scripture now. It was his connection to the man he used to be, the moral compass that kept him human when the mountains threatened to make him as wild and untamed as the wolves that howled in the darkness. Sometimes he would read the familiar passages by firelight, hearing Sarah's voice in the ancient words, feeling her gentle guidance in the verses about forgiveness and redemption. Other times, he simply held the book against his chest and let the weight of it anchor him to something larger than his own pain. The abandoned cabin sat in a natural clearing about 12 miles northeast of Cedar Falls, the closest thing to civilization in these parts. Cedar Falls was hardly more than a trading post with ambitions, perhaps 30 souls on a good day, including the drifters and prospectors who came and went like tumbleweeds. But it had a general store, a saloon, and a small church that served the scattered homesteaders brave enough to try making a living in this unforgiving country. Ezra had visited Cedar Falls only a handful of times in his 4 years of mountain living, but each visit had left him with a growing sense that complete isolation might not be the answer to his grief. There was something in the way Martha Caldwell, who ran the general store, treated him with quiet dignity despite his wild appearance. She never asked prying questions about his past or offered unwanted sympathy, but there was kindness in her eyes and a strength in her bearing that reminded him of Sarah in unexpected moments. Martha was a widow herself. though her loss was more recent and perhaps more brutal than his own. Her husband, Tom, had been a deputy sheriff, killed by claim jumpers 2 winters past while trying to protect a family of prospectors from being murdered for their modest strike. She had taken over the general store not from choice but from necessity, and she ran it with the practical competence of a woman who had learned that survival required both toughness and grace. The cabin itself told a story of hope abandoned. Someone had put considerable effort into its construction, using good timber and solid craftsmanship that spoke of permanent intentions rather than temporary shelter. The walls were thick enough to hold against winter storms, and the foundation was set on solid rock that would last generations. But the roof had developed leaks, the windows were cracked or missing their glass, and weeds had grown up through the floorboards, where rain had found its way inside. More intriguing than the cabin's construction was the mystery surrounding its abandonment. According to the talk in Cedar Falls, the place had belonged to a German prospector named Heinrich Müller, who had simply vanished about 3 years ago. His horse had wandered back to town riderless one morning, but no trace of Müller himself was ever found. Some claimed he had been killed by claim jumpers or wild animals. Others suggested he had found a rich strike and left for Denver or San Francisco without bothering to tell anyone. The more superstitious folk whispered about Indian curses and vengeful spirits. What everyone agreed on was that the land was worthless for farming or ranching. The soil was thin and rocky, suitable only for the hardy grasses and scrub brush that somehow managed to survive the harsh winters and dry summers. There was no reliable water source nearby. The nearest creek was more than a mile away and ran dry most summers. Any sensible man would have passed it by in favor of better ground closer to town. But Ezra Stone was no longer entirely sensible, at least not in the conventional way. What others saw as worthless isolation, he saw as privacy. What they viewed as cursed ground, he recognized as simply difficult, and he had made his peace with difficulty long ago. The cabin offered him something no amount of gold could buy: legitimacy. A chance to rejoin the human race without having to explain where he had been or why he had chosen to leave it in the first place. The legal transfer had been surprisingly simple. The territorial government was eager to see abandoned properties put to productive use, and no one else had shown even passing interest in Müller's old claim. For the price of back taxes, less than $20, Ezra Stone became the owner of 40 acres of rocky ground and one neglected cabin. It was, by any reasonable measure, a foolish purchase, but as Ezra walked through the rooms that would become his home, running his hands along the solid timber walls and feeling the permanence of the stone foundation beneath his feet, he felt something he had almost forgotten: hope. Not the wild, desperate hope of his younger days, but the quiet, steady hope of a man who has learned to appreciate simple shelter and the possibility of productive work. The cabin had 3 rooms: a main living area with a stone fireplace, a smaller room that could serve as a bedroom, and a lean-to kitchen that would need considerable work before it was functional. Müller had built well, with an eye toward comfort as well as durability. The fireplace drew cleanly, and the logs were chinked tight enough to keep out all but the worst weather. With some basic repairs and improvements, it would be a fine place to spend the years ahead. As the afternoon wore on and shadows began to lengthen, Ezra found himself drawn repeatedly to the area behind the cabin, where weeds and brush had grown wild in the years of abandonment. There was something about the way the land lay that suggested human alteration, subtle changes in elevation and drainage, that spoke of purposeful work rather than natural formation. It was during his 3rd or 4th circuit of the property that he noticed the depression in the ground, roughly circular and perhaps 8 feet across. At first glance, it appeared to be nothing more than a natural hollow where rainwater might collect, but closer examination revealed worked stone around its edges. The stones were weathered and partially buried, but they formed a definite pattern, the outline of what could only be a well. Heavy planks lay across the opening, secured with iron brackets that had rusted but still held firm. Someone had gone to considerable trouble to seal this well, using materials that would have been expensive and difficult to transport to such a remote location. The effort suggested either extreme caution or deliberate concealment. Standing there in the fading light of his first day as a property owner, Ezra felt the stirring of curiosity he had not experienced in years. Why would Muller have sealed a perfectly good well? Water was precious in this dry country, and a reliable source would have made the property significantly more valuable. Yet here was evidence of a deliberate decision to make the well unusable, to hide it beneath planks and let it disappear under growing weeds. The mystery of the sealed well seemed to embody everything about his new life, hidden potential beneath a carefully constructed barrier, secrets waiting to be uncovered by someone willing to do the hard work of revelation. As darkness began to gather in the valley below, and the first stars appeared above the mountain peaks, Ezra made his decision. Tomorrow he would begin the work of making this place truly his. And part of that work would involve learning what Heinrich Müller had been so determined to hide. That first night in the cabin, Ezra built a small fire in the stone fireplace and sat before it with his Bible open on his lap. The familiar weight of the book, the soft leather worn smooth by countless readings, brought him the comfort he had come to depend upon in moments of uncertainty. The pressed wildflowers between the pages released their faint, sweet fragrance, a ghostly reminder of Sarah's gentle hands and her delight in the simple beauty of growing things. "Lord," he whispered to the dancing flames, "I don't pretend to understand your ways. You took my family when they had so much life left to live, and you've brought me to this empty place when I thought my story was finished. But if there's purpose in this, if there's work for these old hands to do, then give me the wisdom to see it clearly." The fire crackled its response, sending sparks up the chimney toward the star-filled sky. Outside, the night sounds of the high country began their familiar symphony. The distant howl of coyotes, the rustle of small creatures in the underbrush, the whisper of wind through pine needles. These were the sounds that had lulled him to sleep for 4 years, but tonight they seemed different somehow, less lonely and more like a welcome. Sleep came easier than it had in months. The solid walls around him, the warm weight of the Bible against his chest, and the simple satisfaction of legal ownership combined to give him the deepest rest he had known since leaving Kansas. He dreamed of Sarah tending a garden where wildflowers grew among vegetables, of his children playing in a yard where sunlight filtered through pine branches. When he woke at dawn, the dreams lingered with unusual clarity, as if they were not mere memories, but possibilities waiting to be reclaimed. The morning light revealed details about the cabin and its surroundings that the previous day's exploration had missed. Muller had been a meticulous man, Ezra realized, noting the careful way tools and supplies had been stored, the orderly arrangement of furniture, the practical improvements that spoke of someone who intended to stay. A set of good German-made hand tools hung from pegs along one wall, their edges still sharp, despite 3 years of abandonment. Books in both German and English filled a small shelf beside the fireplace, volumes on mining techniques, geology, and natural philosophy that suggested an educated mind at work. More intriguing were the personal touches that revealed something of the man who had built this place. A small wooden cross hung above the door, carved with obvious skill and marked with what appeared to be a family crest. Photographs in simple frames showed a stern-faced man with kind eyes standing beside a woman and 2 young children, clearly Müller's family, left behind in whatever German homeland. He had departed to seek his fortune in the American territories. The similarity between Müller's story and his own was not lost on Ezra. Both men had come to this isolated place carrying the weight of loss, seeking something that civilization could not provide. The difference was that Müller had brought hope, while Ezra had brought only the desire to disappear. Now, surrounded by the tangible evidence of another man's dreams, Ezra began to wonder if hope might be something that could be rebuilt rather than simply mourned. His first practical task was to assess what repairs the cabin would need before winter. The roof required immediate attention. Several shingles had blown away, and the resulting leaks had damaged some of the interior walls. The windows would need new glass, and the kitchen area needed extensive work before it would be functional. But the fundamental structure was sound, and with steady work throughout the summer and fall, he could make it comfortable. The sealed well, however, drew his attention like a magnet. Throughout the morning, as he examined the cabin's condition and made mental notes about necessary repairs, he found himself returning to the mysterious depression behind the building. The heavy planks covering it appeared to have been cut from good timber, and the iron brackets holding them in place showed the kind of craftsmanship that cost serious money. Someone had wanted this well sealed permanently, not simply covered for temporary protection. By midday, curiosity had overcome caution. Using a pry bar he found among Muller's tools, Ezra began the careful work of removing the brackets and planks. The metal had rusted tight, and progress was slow, but the physical effort felt good after months of aimless wandering. There was purpose in this work, direction in the steady rhythm of lever and lift, pry and pull. The first plank came free with a groan of protesting wood and metal. Beneath it the darkness was absolute, revealing nothing of what lay below. The second plank proved easier, and then the third, until finally the well opening lay exposed to sunlight for the first time in years. What Ezra saw when he peered into the depths took his breath away. The well was deeper than he had expected, perhaps 30 feet from surface to bottom, lined with carefully fitted stones that spoke of expert masonry work. But it was not the craftsmanship that made him catch his breath. It was the way the afternoon sunlight caught and reflected off something at the bottom, sending sparkles of light dancing up the stone walls like captured stars. Gold. There was no mistaking that particular gleam, that warm reflection that had driven men to cross continents and risk everything they possessed. Ezra had seen enough raw ore during his years in the mountains to recognize the real thing, and what lay at the bottom of Mueller's well was unquestionably the genuine article. Not just traces or promising samples, but what appeared to be a substantial accumulation of nuggets and raw ore that represented serious wealth. The implications hit him like a physical blow. This was why Mueller had sealed the well. This was why he had covered his treasure and let weeds grow over it, rather than extracting it for sale. But why? What could drive a man to hide such wealth rather than enjoy it? And what had happened to Mueller himself? As the sun moved across the sky and shadows began to lengthen, Ezra found himself staring into the well's depths and wrestling with questions that had no easy answers. The gold was there, real and tangible, and probably worth more money than he had ever imagined possessing. But it was also hidden for reasons he did not yet understand, concealed by a man who had vanished without explanation. Standing there in the growing twilight of his second day as a property owner, Ezra felt the weight of destiny settling around his shoulders like a familiar coat. Whatever had driven Heinrich Müller to hide this treasure, whatever fears had made him seal away such wealth, Ezra Stone was now the inheritor of both the gold and the mystery that surrounded it. The question was whether he had the wisdom to handle such an inheritance, or whether the secret of the well would prove as dangerous to him as it apparently had been to its previous keeper. The third morning dawned clear and cold, with frost painting delicate patterns on the cabin windows. Ezra woke with the image of gold still burning in his mind, the memory of that warm gleam reflecting up from the well's depths. He had spent a restless night wrestling with questions that seemed to multiply rather than resolve themselves. The discovery had transformed everything. What had begun as a simple attempt to start over had become something far more complex and potentially dangerous. After a breakfast of coffee and hardtack, Ezra returned to the well with a coil of rope and a lantern. He needed to see more clearly what lay below, to understand the full scope of what Muller had hidden. The descent into the well was treacherous. The stone walls were slick with moisture, and the handholds were uncertain, but his years of mountain living had given him the skills needed for such work. At the bottom, crouched in the narrow space between the stone walls, Ezra could scarcely believe what surrounded him. Nuggets of gold, some as large as his thumb, lay scattered among chunks of quartz shot through with veins of precious metal. This was not the result of casual prospecting or lucky finds. This represented systematic mining, the accumulation of wealth over months or perhaps years of dedicated work. But it was what he found wedged into a crevice between two stones that truly changed everything. A leather journal, wrapped in oiled cloth to protect it from moisture, bore the careful script of Heinrich Müller. The water damage was minimal, and most of the entries remained legible. As Ezra climbed back to the surface and settled beside the well to read, the journal revealed a story that made his blood run cold. Müller's entries began with the excitement of discovery. He had found this place in 1878, drawn by promising geological formations that suggested mineral deposits. His early entries described the systematic exploration of the area, the location of several promising sites, and the gradual realization that he had stumbled upon something extraordinary. June 15, 1878, one entry read, "The vein continues deeper than I dared hope. This is not simply a surface deposit, but what appears to be a substantial mother lode. I have extracted nearly 40 pounds of ore this week alone, and there appears to be much more. If my estimates are correct, this claim could yield wealth beyond imagination." The entries continued through the summer and fall of 1878, documenting Müller's careful work and growing excitement. He wrote of his plans to bring his family from Germany, of purchasing land and building a proper house where his wife and children could join him in prosperity. The careful German's methodical nature was evident in every entry. Detailed maps of his workings, precise records of extraction quantities, careful notes about the best techniques for processing the ore. But as winter approached, the tone of the entries began to change. Müller wrote of strangers in Cedar Falls, men asking questions about his activities. He described the growing sense that he was being watched, that his movements were being noted by unfriendly eyes. By December of 1878, paranoia had crept into his careful script. December 3, 1878, the journal recorded, "The Taggart brothers have arrived in Cedar Falls. I know their reputation, and their presence here cannot be coincidence. They have killed men for far less than what I have found. I must be more careful, more secretive. Perhaps it would be wise to hide the gold until spring, when I can arrange for proper transportation and protection." The name Taggart sent a chill through Ezra's soul. Even in his isolation, he had heard whispers of the brothers, claimed jumpers and murderers who had terrorized mining camps throughout the territory. They were said to be utterly ruthless, killing not just for gold, but for the pleasure it gave them. If they had been tracking Müller, his caution had been well-founded. As Ezra read on, the entries became increasingly urgent and frightened. Müller wrote of abandoning his active mining operations, of focusing instead on concealing what he had already extracted. He described his decision to hide the gold in the well, reasoning that no one would think to look for treasure in a water source. The well had been dry for years, he noted, making it the perfect hiding place. January 20th, 1879, the journal continued, "I have moved all the gold to the well and sealed it as thoroughly as I can manage. If something happens to me, perhaps future generations will discover it and put it to better use. I pray that God will protect me, but I fear the Taggarts are closing in. They have been asking questions in town, offering money for information about my activities. Someone will eventually talk." The final entries were brief and increasingly desperate. Müller wrote of his decision to leave temporarily, to travel to Denver and arrange for official protection before returning to claim his treasure. He planned to ride out under cover of darkness, circle wide around Cedar Falls, and make his way to the territorial capital, where he could register his claim properly and arrange for military escort back to his holdings. The last entry was dated February 15, 1879. "I leave tonight. If I do not return, may God forgive me for bringing such wealth into the world, only to hide it again. I have left maps and detailed notes about the location of all my workings, hidden where only someone who truly owns this land might find them. Perhaps someday a righteous man will discover what I have been forced to abandon. Ezra set the journal aside and stared into the depths of the well, understanding now why Muller had never returned. The Taggarts had caught him almost certainly, and the careful German prospector had died protecting the secret of his treasure. The gold had lain hidden for 3 years, waiting for someone to uncover both the wealth and the danger that came with it. But the journal contained more than just the history of Müller's fear. As Ezra examined it more carefully, he discovered that several pages near the back had been designed to fold out, revealing hand-drawn maps of the surrounding area. These were not simple sketches, but detailed surveys showing the location of multiple mining sites, water sources, and what appeared to be a network of tunnels and workings that extended far beyond the immediate vicinity of the cabin. Müller had not been working a single claim, but had discovered an entire system of gold-bearing formations. The well was just the storage point for his accumulated wealth. The maps showed at least 6 different sites where he had been actively mining, each marked with symbols indicating the quality and quantity of ore available. If the maps were accurate, the 40 pounds of gold in the well represented only a fraction of what was potentially available. The implications were staggering. Ezra was not just the inheritor of a hidden treasure, but the owner of what appeared to be one of the richest gold claims in the territory. The wealth represented by Müller's discoveries could transform not just his own life, but the entire economy of the region. And therein lay the danger. As he studied the maps more carefully, Ezra began to understand the scope of Müller's operation and the reasons for his ultimate downfall. The German had been too successful, too visible in his prosperity. Despite his attempts at secrecy, word of his success had leaked out, drawing the attention of men like the Taggart brothers, who made their living stealing from honest prospectors. Now Ezra faced the same choices that had confronted Müller 3 years earlier. He could attempt to work the claims openly, risking the same fate that had befallen the previous owner. He could try to extract the gold secretly, hoping to avoid detection until he had accumulated enough wealth to hire protection. Or he could walk away, seal the well again, and pretend he had never made the discovery. But even as he considered the third option, Ezra knew it was not really a choice at all. The gold was there, real and tangible and representing the kind of security he had never dared dream of possessing. More than that, it represented the possibility of honoring Müller's memory by putting the treasure to the use the careful German had intended, building something permanent and good in this harsh country. As the sun reached its zenith and began its descent toward the western peaks, Ezra made his decision. He would not abandon the gold, but neither would he repeat Müller's mistakes. He would proceed carefully, quietly, learning from the other man's experience while preparing for the dangers that would inevitably come. The first step was to understand exactly what he possessed. That meant a careful exploration of Müller's maps, a survey of the various mining sites, and an assessment of how much gold might realistically be extracted without drawing unwanted attention. It also meant learning more about the current whereabouts and activities of the Taggart brothers, information that would require a careful trip to Cedar Falls and some discreet inquiries. But as Ezra began planning his next moves, he was haunted by the final image from Müller's journal, a careful, methodical man driven to desperation by greed that was not his own. The gold in the well represented opportunity, but it also represented danger of the most deadly kind. The question was whether Ezra Stone possessed the wisdom and skill to succeed where Heinrich Müller had failed, or whether the treasure would prove as fatal to him as it had to its previous keeper. 3 days of careful study had revealed the true scope of Heinrich Müller's discoveries. The hidden map concealed in the journal's binding with the skill of a man who understood the value of secrets, showed a network of gold deposits that defied belief. Ezra traced the carefully drawn lines with his finger, noting the Germans' meticulous attention to detail, elevation marks, water sources, geological formations, and most importantly, the symbols that indicated confirmed gold strikes. The map revealed 6 major sites within a 2-mile radius of the cabin, each marked with Mueller's own coding system. A circle meant surface deposits suitable for panning. A square indicated underground veins requiring shaft work. A triangle marked areas where the ore was particularly rich, worth the extra effort of careful extraction. By Mueller's calculations, scribbled in the margins in his precise script, the total potential yield could exceed 500 pounds of gold, wealth that would make a man richer than most Eastern businessmen. But it was the 7th mark on the map that made Ezra's hands tremble as he studied it by lamplight. Near the eastern edge of his property, Mueller had drawn a star and written beside it in German, Der Mutterlode, the mother lode. According to his notes, this was where the various veins converged, where the geological forces that had created the scattered deposits came together in what he estimated could be the richest single site in the entire territory. Ezra's first expedition to confirm the map's accuracy took him along a deer trail that wound through dense pine forest toward the eastern boundary of his land. Mueller's directions were precise. Follow the creek bed for half a mile, then turn north at the lightning-struck pine. Climb to the ridge where 3 boulders formed a natural gateway. Each landmark appeared exactly as described, testament to the Germans' careful observation and planning. The first site, marked with a circle on the map, proved to be a small creek where the water had carved through a gold-bearing formation. Even without proper equipment, Ezra could see flakes of gold in the creek bed, gleaming among the ordinary stones and gravel. This was where Mueller had likely begun his work, banning the easy surface deposits before moving on to more ambitious projects. The second site required more effort to reach, following a switchback trail up a steep hillside to where Mueller had sunk a shaft into solid rock. The opening was concealed behind brush that had grown up in the 3 years since the Germans' disappearance, but the excavation itself showed the marks of systematic work. Test samples from the tunnel walls still showed traces of gold, confirming that Mueller's assessment had been accurate. But it was the third site that truly demonstrated the scope of what Ezra had inherited. Hidden in a natural depression between 2 ridges, Mueller had created an entire mining operation. A series of tunnels extended into the hillside, supported by carefully placed timber and showing evidence of extensive extraction work. Piles of processed ore, still rich with gold content, lay covered by canvas that had protected them from 3 winters of mountain weather. As Ezra explored the tunnels by lantern light, he began to understand both Mueller's success and his ultimate downfall. The German had been working these sites with the efficiency and thoroughness that only comes from professional mining experience. The tunnels were properly ventilated. The support timbers were placed according to established engineering principles, and the extraction had been done with careful attention to maximizing yield while maintaining safety. But such extensive operations could not be hidden indefinitely. The amount of material Mueller had moved, the trails he had created between sites, the very scope of his success would have been visible to anyone who knew what to look for. No wonder the Taggart brothers had eventually tracked him down. An operation this size could not remain secret forever. The implications for his own situation were clear. Ezra could not simply continue Mueller's work where the German had left off. The old mining sites were too visible, too well established to escape notice if anyone came looking. He would need to develop his own approach, one that balanced the need for secrecy with the practical requirements of gold extraction. The solution came to him as he made his way back toward the cabin in the fading light of afternoon. Rather than working the established sites, he would focus initially on the hidden gold in the wealth that was already extracted and ready for transport. This would give him the capital needed to prepare for larger operations, while allowing him to assess the current level of threat from claim jumpers and other dangers. But first, he needed information about the present situation in Cedar Falls. 3 years had passed since Muller's disappearance. Were the Taggart brothers still in the area? Had other prospectors moved into the region? What was the current state of law enforcement, and could he expect any protection if his activities were discovered? The ride to Cedar Falls took most of the morning, following trails that wound through valleys and over ridges where the autumn aspen were beginning to turn gold against the dark green of the pine forests. Ezra had made this journey before, but always as a wild mountain man seeking only basic supplies. Today he rode as a property owner, a man with legitimate business in the settlement, and the difference in his own demeanor surprised him. Martha Caldwell was sweeping the front porch of her general store when Ezra arrived, and her smile of welcome was warmer than he had expected. In the 3 years since her husband's death, she had aged gracefully, developing the quiet strength that comes from successfully managing difficult circumstances. Her dark hair was streaked with premature gray, but her eyes remained bright with intelligence and carefully guarded kindness. "Mr. Stone," she said, setting aside her broom, "I heard you'd taken over the old Muller place. Folks said you were planning to settle down instead of just passing through." "Yes, ma'am," Ezra replied, surprised by how good it felt to be recognized, to be part of the community conversation instead of existing on its margins. "The cabin needs work, but it's solid. I'm hoping to make it home." Martha's expression grew thoughtful. Heinrich was a good man, kept to himself but honest in his dealings. "It's a shame what happened to him." She paused, studying Ezra's face. "Have you found any trace of what became of him? Any sign of where he might have gone?" The question hung in the air between them, loaded with implications that Ezra was not ready to address directly. "Nothing definitive," he said carefully. "But I've been wondering about the troubles he might have had. I've heard mention of the Taggart brothers in connection with his disappearance." Martha's face darkened at the mention of the name. "Evil men," she said quietly. "They killed my Tom when he tried to protect the Williams family from their claim jumping. Shot him down like a dog when he tried to arrest them for murder." Her voice carried a weight of grief that was still fresh despite the passage of time. "Are they still in the area?" Ezra asked, though he dreaded the answer. "They come and go," Martha replied. "No one's seen them for several months, but that doesn't mean much. They have a way of appearing when least expected, especially when word spreads about new strikes or successful claims." She looked at him more intently. "You're not planning any prospecting, are you, Mr. Stone? Because if you are, you need to know what you're dealing with." The concern in her voice touched something in Ezra that had been dormant for years. Here was someone who cared about his welfare, who was warning him of danger, not from idle curiosity, but from genuine worry about his safety. The realization that he was no longer completely alone in the world came as both comfort and responsibility. "I appreciate the warning," he said. "Right now I'm just focused on getting the cabin livable before winter. But it's good to know about potential troubles." Martha nodded, but her expression suggested she was not entirely convinced by his casual dismissal of the mining question. "If you do decide to do any digging, be careful who you trust. Word travels fast in a small community, and not everyone who seems friendly has good intentions." As Ezra purchased supplies for his cabin repairs, he found himself studying the other customers in the store with new attention. Which of these men might be the type to sell information to claim jumpers? Who could be trusted with secrets, and who would betray a neighbor for the right price? The paranoia that had consumed Muller began to seem less like madness, and more like simple prudence. The ride back to the cabin took him through country that seemed different now that he knew what lay hidden beneath its surface. Every ridge and valley represented potential wealth, but also potential danger. The gold that Muller had found and hidden was real, but so were the men who would kill for it. As the sun set behind the western peaks and the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, Ezra understood that his new life would require not just the skills of a prospector and homesteader, but the cunning of a man who must protect deadly secrets from deadly enemies. The weight of secrecy proved heavier than Ezra had anticipated. For 2 weeks after his conversation with Martha, he had worked alone on the cabin repairs, all the while feeling the pull of the gold in the well like a constant ache. Every morning he would find reasons to walk past the sealed opening, fighting the urge to extract some of the treasure for closer examination. Every evening he would sit by the fire with Muller's journal, studying the maps and planning operations he was not yet ready to begin. The loneliness of carrying such a burden finally drove him back to Cedar Falls on a grey October morning when the first serious snow threatened in the heavy clouds that hung around the mountain peaks. He told himself he needed additional supplies for winter preparation, but the truth was simpler. He needed human contact with someone he could trust. Even if he could not share the full truth of his situation, Martha was arranging new inventory when he entered the store, and her smile of greeting carried a warmth that reminded him powerfully of Sarah. The comparison was not entirely comfortable. Martha was a different woman, with her own strengths and sorrows, but the simple pleasure of being welcomed by someone who cared about his welfare was too precious to analyze too closely. "You're looking more settled," she observed, as he examined a selection of winter clothing. "The mountain living agrees with you, I think." "It does," Ezra agreed, "though I've been wondering about some practical matters. You mentioned that your late husband was a deputy. Did he ever deal with mining claims and such?" "I've been finding some interesting rock formations on my land." Martha paused in her work, fixing him with a direct look that suggested she understood more than he was saying. "Tom handled all kinds of territorial law," she said carefully, "including claim registration and protection. Why? Have you found something that needs official attention?" The moment stretched between them, loaded with unspoken questions and careful evasions. Ezra found himself studying Martha's face, noting the intelligence in her dark eyes and the strength in the set of her jaw. This was a woman who had survived her husband's murder and built a successful business in dangerous country. She was not someone who would be easily fooled, nor someone who would betray a confidence lightly. "Perhaps," Ezra said finally. "Nothing definitive yet, but I'd like to understand the proper procedures before I commit to anything significant." Martha set down the bolt of cloth she had been handling and moved closer, lowering her voice. "Ezra," she said, using his first name for the first time, "if you've found mineral deposits on your land, you need to be very careful how you proceed. Tom died because he tried to protect people who weren't careful enough. The use of his given name created an intimacy that surprised him, a suggestion that their relationship had moved beyond simple customer and merchant. "What would you recommend?" he asked. "Honestly, I'd recommend you forget whatever you think you found and focus on farming or ranching. But if you can't do that," she reached beneath the counter and produced a small object wrapped in cloth. This was Tom's badge. He always said that sometimes the only law in the territory is what a man carries with him. She unwrapped the cloth to reveal a tarnished tin star, the symbol of territorial authority that her husband had worn when he died, trying to protect innocent people from the Taggart brothers. The badge was simple and worn, but it represented something that Ezra had been missing in his calculations, the possibility of legitimate law enforcement support. Tom believed that good men had a responsibility to stand up to evil ones, Martha continued, but he also believed that good men shouldn't have to stand alone. If you're planning something that might attract the wrong kind of attention, you need allies you can trust. Ezra took the badge, feeling its weight in his palm. The metal was cool and substantial, a tangible reminder of the price that civilization exacted from those who tried to maintain it. "Are you suggesting I should trust you with whatever I might find?" "I'm suggesting that you shouldn't try to handle dangerous secrets alone," Martha replied. "Tom tried that, and it got him killed. The Taggart brothers didn't just murder him for interfering with their claim. They killed him because he knew too much. about their operations and didn't have enough backup to protect himself. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of another customer, an older man whom Martha introduced as Frank Gibson, a rancher from the valley south of town. Gibson was friendly enough, but Ezra noticed how the man's eyes lingered on his face, as if trying to place him or remember where they might have met. It was exactly the kind of attention that had made Muller paranoid, and Ezra understood now how quickly a man's presence could become known throughout a small community. After Gibson left with his purchases, Martha returned to their interrupted conversation. "Frank's a good man," she said, "but he talks a lot. If you're trying to keep anything secret, you need to assume that anything Frank sees or hears will be known throughout the territory within a week. Then I should probably be more careful about my visits to town," Ezra said. "Or you should give people a reasonable explanation for your presence," Martha suggested. "People will notice you're coming and going regardless. Better to control what they think they know than to let them speculate." The wisdom of her advice was obvious, but it also highlighted the complexity of his situation. To maintain the secrecy necessary for safely extracting Muller's gold, he would need to develop a plausible cover story for his activities. But creating such a story would require him to trust someone with at least part of the truth. And trust was a luxury that had gotten the previous owner of his land killed. As if reading his thoughts, Martha continued, "Tom used to say that the difference between a successful secret and a deadly one was knowing who to trust and how much to tell them. Complete secrecy is impossible in a small community, but careful secrecy can be maintained indefinitely." Ezra studied her face, weighing the risks of partial confession against the dangers of continued isolation. Martha had lost her husband to the same forces that had killed Muller, which gave her a personal stake in seeing justice done. She understood the nature of the threats he faced and had the intelligence to appreciate the complexity of his situation. Most importantly, she had demonstrated both discretion and courage in the years since her husband's death. "Suppose," Ezra said carefully, "a man found something valuable on his land. Something that might attract the wrong kind of attention if word got out. What would be the smartest way to handle such a situation?" Martha's expression grew serious. First, he would need to understand exactly what he possessed. How much, how valuable, how difficult to extract. Second, he would need to assess the current threat level from claim jumpers and other dangers. Third, he would need to develop a plan for safely converting his discovery into transportable wealth. The specificity of her response suggested that she had given considerable thought to such scenarios, probably in connection with her husband's law enforcement work. And if the discovery was substantial enough to change a man's life completely, then he would need to be prepared for the possibility that the discovery might also end his life, Martha said quietly. Tom investigated dozens of claim-jumping cases, and the pattern was always the same. Someone finds wealth, someone else learns about it, and violence follows as surely as night follows day. The conversation was interrupted again, this time by a group of travelers who needed supplies for their journey west. But as Ezra watched Martha interact with the strangers, friendly but cautious, helpful but revealing nothing unnecessary, he began to understand what she was offering him, not just advice but partnership. The wisdom that came from having lived through the kind of danger he was facing, combined with the local knowledge and community connections he would need to survive. When the travelers had departed and they were alone again, Ezra made his decision. Suppose this hypothetical man had found something that Heinrich Muller left behind, something that explained what happened to him and why. Martha's breath caught, and for a moment her carefully maintained composure slipped to reveal the excitement and apprehension beneath. "How substantial a discovery are we discussing?" "Substantial enough that the Taggart brothers would consider it worth killing for," Ezra replied. "Substantial enough that a careful man might want to proceed very slowly, and with trusted help." The admission hung between them like a bridge that could either connect them in partnership or collapse under the weight of the secrets it would have to bear. Martha was quiet for a long moment, her dark eyes studying his face as if trying to read the extent of his trustworthiness. "If such a discovery exists," she said finally, "then the hypothetical man would need to understand that he has inherited not just Heinrich's treasure, but also Heinrich's enemies." The Taggarts didn't give up when Heinrich disappeared. They're still looking for what he found. And now they'll be looking for whoever might have found it after him. The weight of her words settled over Ezra like a cold mountain wind. The gold in the well was real, but so was the danger that came with it. The question was whether he possessed the courage and cunning to succeed where Heinrich Müller had failed, and whether Martha Caldwell was willing to risk her own life to help him try. The discovery came at dawn on a frost-brittle morning in late October, when Ezra was making his third careful descent into the well to examine Müller's treasure more systematically. He had rigged a pulley system using rope and timber, allowing him to lower tools and raise samples without the exhausting climb up and down the stone walls. But it was not the gold that caught his attention this time. It was the pickaxe wedged behind a loose stone near the well's bottom. The tool was clearly of European manufacture, heavier and more precisely balanced than the American-made implements he was familiar with. Engraved on the steel head were the initials HM, and beneath them, etched with obvious skill, a family crest showing crossed hammers beneath a stylized mountain peak. This was Heinrich Müller's personal mining tool, crafted specifically for him and marked with the symbols of his heritage and profession. But it was the condition of the pickaxe that sent a chill through Ezra's bones. The wooden handle was stained dark with what could only be blood, and the steel head bore scratches and dents that spoke of violence rather than mining work. This tool had been used as a weapon in Müller's final moments, evidence of a desperate fight that had ended with the German prospector's death. As Ezra examined the pickaxe more carefully, other details became apparent. Wrapped around the handle, nearly invisible unless examined closely, was a thin strip of paper covered with Müller's careful script. The message was brief but urgent. They came at night, 3 of them. Brennan led them to me. "Trust no one who claims to be law. The map in my Bible shows the true mother lode. Tell my Anna I died thinking of her." The revelation that someone named Brennan had betrayed Müller added a new dimension of danger to Ezra's situation. This was not simply a case of claim jumpers discovering a rich strike through observation or luck. Müller had been betrayed by someone he trusted, someone who had gained his confidence sufficiently to learn the location of his hideout. The reference to Müller's Bible sent Ezra scrambling back up the well rope with desperate urgency. He had noticed the small leather-bound volume among the Germans' possessions, but had not examined it closely, assuming it was simply a personal devotional book. Now, with Müller's dying message burning in his mind, he searched the cabin until he found the Bible on a shelf beside the German's bed. The book was written in German, but the maps Müller had mentioned were drawn on thin paper and inserted between the pages, like bookmarks. These were far more detailed than the maps in the journal, showing not just the locations of mining sites, but the geological features that connected them. And there, marked with the same star symbol he had seen on the other map, was the location of the mother lode, a site nearly 3 miles from the cabin, hidden in a canyon so remote that Ezra had never ventured near it during his years of mountain living. According to Müller's notes, this site represented the source of all the gold deposits in the area. The other locations were secondary formations where ore had been distributed by geological action over thousands of years. But the mother lode was the original vein, a formation that could contain wealth beyond imagination, if a man could figure out how to extract it safely. The prospect of such wealth was intoxicating. But Müller's final message served as a sobering reminder of the price that might be exacted for pursuing it. The German had been killed not by strangers who had discovered his secret through observation, but by people he had trusted with information. The betrayal had been personal and deliberate, which meant that the same fate could befall anyone who made the mistake of trusting the wrong person. The sound of approaching horses brought Ezra's speculation to an abrupt halt. Through the cabin's front window, he could see 3 riders approaching at a steady pace, their movement suggesting purpose rather than casual travel. His first instinct was to hide Muller's materials, but there was no time. The riders would reach the cabin within minutes. Instead, Ezra grabbed his rifle and positioned himself where he could observe the approaching men, while remaining concealed behind the cabin's thick log walls. The riders were strangers, but their equipment and bearing suggested they were not casual travelers. All 3 were well armed and mounted on good horses, and they approached the cabin with the careful tactics of men who expected potential trouble. The leader was a tall man with graying hair and the bearing of someone accustomed to authority. He wore a badge on his vest and called out in a voice that carried the practiced confidence of law enforcement. "Hello in the cabin. I'm Marshal Tom Brennan, Territorial Authority. I'd like to speak with the property owner." The name Brennan hit Ezra like a physical blow. According to Muller's final message, this was the man who had betrayed the German prospector to his killers. Yet here he was, 3 years later, wearing a badge and claiming legal authority. The brazenness of it was staggering, using the very office that should have protected Muller to facilitate his murder. "What's your business here, Marshal?" Ezra called back, keeping his rifle ready while remaining out of sight. "Routine inquiry," Brennan replied. "We've had reports of unusual activity in this area. Thought we should check in with the new property owner, make sure everything's peaceful." The careful phrasing of the response confirmed Ezra's suspicions. Brennan was fishing for information, trying to determine how much the current occupant might know about Muller's discoveries. The reports of unusual activity were almost certainly fabricated, an excuse to justify investigating the property where the German had hidden his treasure. "Everything's peaceful here," Ezra replied. "Just working on cabin repairs before winter sets in. Mind if we take a look around?" Brennan asked. "Official business, you understand. Won't take but a few minutes." The request was phrased politely, but the underlying threat was clear. Brennan had not come alone, and his companions were positioned to cover the cabin's exits. This was not a request, but a demand backed by superior numbers and the claimed authority of territorial law. Refusing would only confirm their suspicions that he had something to hide. "Come ahead," Ezra said, making his voice sound reluctant but cooperative. "Though I don't know what you expect to find." Previous owner left the place pretty empty. Brennan and his men dismounted and approached the cabin with the systematic thoroughness of an organized search. They examined the exterior walls, checked the outbuildings, and paid particular attention to any signs of recent excavation or disturbance. Ezra watched through the window as one of them examined the area around the well, noting with relief that the heavy planks and concealing vegetation made the opening nearly invisible, unless someone knew exactly where to look. When Brennan entered the cabin, his eyes moved with the practiced efficiency of someone who knew what he was looking for. He examined Muller's remaining possessions with obvious familiarity, confirming that he had been here before. But his search was careful to appear casual, maintaining the pretense of routine law enforcement rather than revealing his true purpose. "You're Ezra Stone, I take it," Brennan said, settling into a chair as if he owned the place. "Heard you bought this property from the territorial government." "Interesting choice. Most folks avoid places with Heinrich Müller's history, don't believe in curses," Ezra replied, trying to match Brennan's casual tone while keeping his rifle within easy reach. "Seemed like good land at a fair price." Brennan's smile was thin and predatory. "Müller was a secretive man. Never did figure out what happened to him. One day he was here, next day he was gone. Left behind some interesting equipment, though." He gestured toward the German mining tools hanging on the wall. "You find anything else he might have left behind? Papers, maps, anything that might explain where he went?" The question was asked with studied casualness, but Ezra could see the tension in Brennan's shoulders, the way his companions had positioned themselves to block the cabin's exits. This was the moment of truth, the test that would determine whether he lived or died. "Nothing but what you see," Ezra said. "Some tools, a few books in German I can't read, basic furniture." If Muller had anything valuable, he took it with him. Brennan studied his face with the intensity of a man accustomed to detecting lies. "Funny thing about Muller," he said conversationally. "He was the type to keep detailed records. German efficiency, you know. Hard to believe he wouldn't have left some kind of documentation behind. Maybe he burned his papers before he left," Ezra suggested. "Man planning to disappear might not want to leave traces behind." Maybe. Brennan stood and walked to the window, looking out at the surrounding terrain with obvious familiarity. "You do any prospecting, Stone?" "This country's got a reputation for mineral deposits. Haven't had time," Ezra replied. "Been focused on making the cabin livable. Though I suppose I might do some panning come spring, if I'm still here." The conversation continued for another 10 minutes, with Brennan probing delicately for any sign that Ezra knew more than he was admitting. But eventually, the false marshal seemed satisfied that his visit had accomplished its purpose. Whether that purpose was gathering information or delivering a warning, Ezra could not be sure. "Well," Brennan said finally, "guess we'll be moving on. You have any trouble out here, strangers poking around, unusual activity, you be sure to let us know. We like to keep track of what's happening in our territory." The possessive phrasing was not lost on Ezra. Brennan was marking his territory, establishing his claim to authority over this area and everything in it. The message was clear. Any discoveries made here would be subject to his oversight, willing or not. After the 3 men had mounted and ridden away, Ezra remained motionless for nearly an hour, watching the surrounding terrain for any sign that they had left someone behind to observe the cabin. Only when he was certain he was truly alone did he allow himself to process what had just occurred. Brennan's visit had not been random or routine. Someone had provided information about Ezra's presence at the old Muller place, and that information had been specific enough to justify an immediate investigation. The most likely source was Frank Gibson, the talkative rancher who had seen him at Martha's store. But it could have been any of a dozen people who had noticed his comings and goings over the past weeks. More troubling was Brennan's obvious familiarity with the cabin and its former occupant. The false marshal had been here before, probably multiple times, and his knowledge of Muller's habits and possessions suggested a relationship that went beyond casual law enforcement contact. Brennan had been close enough to the German prospector to betray him effectively, which meant he was dangerous in ways that went beyond simple criminal activity. The encounter also revealed how precarious Ezra's position had become. Brennan suspected that Muller had left behind something valuable, and he was clearly prepared to use his claimed authority to search for it systematically. The fact that he had not found the well during today's visit was pure luck. Next time, his search might be more thorough. As evening approached and Ezra sat by his fire with Muller's Bible open in his lap, he studied the detailed maps and tried to formulate a plan that would allow him to extract the Germans' treasure before Brennan returned with a more comprehensive search. The pickaxe, resting against the hearth, served as a constant reminder of the price of failure. Its blood-stained handle reflecting the firelight like an accusation. The mother-lode location, shown on Muller's secret map, was both a promise and a threat. If the Germans' estimates were accurate, the site contained enough gold to ensure financial security for life. But reaching it would require venturing into remote country where Brennan's men could easily ambush a lone traveler. And extracting significant quantities of ore would be impossible to conceal indefinitely. The solution, Ezra realized, lay not in avoiding Brennan's attention, but in managing it carefully. He needed to give the false marshal enough information to satisfy his curiosity while concealing the true scope of Muller's discoveries. And he needed to do it in a way that would allow him to extract at least some of the treasure before the inevitable confrontation that would determine whether he shared Heinrich Müller's fate. The wanted poster lay spread across Martha's kitchen table like a declaration of war. The ink was faded, but the faces were clear. 3 men staring out from the paper with the cold eyes of killers. Jacob Taggart, Martha read aloud, her finger tracing the text beneath the first photograph. Wanted for murder, claim jumping, robbery and assault. Known to operate with his brothers Samuel and Moses. Reward, $500 dead or alive. Ezra studied the faces carefully, memorizing every detail. Jacob was the eldest, with a scar running from his left ear to his jaw and eyes that held no warmth or mercy. Samuel appeared younger, but no less dangerous, his thin features sharp with cunning and cruelty. Moses was the largest of the three, with the build of a man who enjoyed violence for its own sake. These are the men who killed your husband, Ezra asked. Among others, Martha replied grimly. They don't work alone. The poster only shows the brothers, but they usually travel with 4 or 5 other men, deserters, drifters, anyone willing to kill for a share of stolen gold. She paused, her dark eyes meeting his. And they're still active. A ranch family near Leadville was murdered just 2 months ago. Their claims stolen, in the same pattern the Taggarts have used for years. The information Martha had gathered since their previous conversation painted a picture that was even more troubling than Ezra had feared. The Taggart brothers were not simply claim jumpers, but the leaders of an organized criminal enterprise that had terrorized mining communities across 3 territories. They moved systematically from area to area, identifying successful prospectors, murdering them, and stealing their claims before moving on to new hunting grounds. The worst part, Martha continued, is that they have help from people who should be protecting honest miners. Corrupt officials, false marshals, even some legitimate lawmen who've been bought or intimidated into cooperation. She looked at him meaningfully. Tom suspected that someone in territorial law enforcement was feeding information to the Taggarts, helping them identify targets and avoid pursuit. The implication was clear. Brennan's visit to the cabin had not been an isolated incident, but part of a larger pattern of surveillance and targeting. The false marshal was gathering intelligence for the Taggart brothers, identifying potential victims and assessing their defenses before the killers moved in for the final attack. "How long do you think I have?" Ezra asked. Martha considered the question carefully. "Based on past patterns, they'll watch you for several weeks, maybe longer. They like to be certain about what they're stealing before they commit to violence. But once they're convinced you have something worth taking, they'll move quickly and without warning." The timeline she described matched what Ezra had learned from Muller's journal. The German had written about strangers asking questions for months before the final attack. The Taggarts were patient predators, willing to invest considerable time in surveillance if it increased their chances of success. "There's something else you need to know," Martha said, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "I've been asking careful questions around town, and there are already rumors starting. Frank Gibson has been telling people that you're acting suspicious, making frequent trips to town for supplies that don't match normal homesteading needs. Others have noticed that you're paying for purchases with unusually good coin, silver that's cleaner and more recent than what most folks carry." The observation hit Ezra like a physical blow. In his caution to avoid extracting gold from the well, he'd been using some of the silver coins from Muller's personal effects to pay for supplies. The irony was bitter. His attempts to avoid attention had actually drawn more notice than simply spending rough frontier currency. "How widespread are these rumors?" he asked. "Still contained to local gossip," Martha replied. "But gossip has a way of reaching the wrong ears, especially when money is involved. If the Taggarts have anyone watching Cedar Falls, and they almost certainly do, they'll hear about suspicious activity sooner rather than later." The conversation was interrupted by a soft knock at Martha's back door. She rose quickly, moving with the practiced efficiency of someone who lived in constant awareness of potential danger. "Stay here," she whispered to Ezra. "Keep quiet unless I call for you." Through the thin wall, Ezra could hear Martha's conversation with the visitor, a woman's voice, speaking in urgent whispers about riders seen near the old Miller Ranch and strange lights observed in the hills north of town. The exchange lasted only a few minutes, but when Martha returned to the kitchen, her face was pale with worry. Sarah Chen, she explained. Her family runs a small mining operation up the valley. She says there have been strangers camping in the area for the past 3 days, men who don't look like ordinary prospectors or travelers. Martha's hands trembled slightly as she refolded the wanted poster. Sarah's description matches the Taggart brothers. The news that the killers were already in the area changed everything. What had been a theoretical future threat was now an immediate and deadly reality. The systematic surveillance that Martha had predicted was already underway, and Ezra's window for safe action was closing rapidly. "I need to get back to the cabin," Ezra said, rising from his chair. "If they're watching the area, they'll notice how long I've been away." "Wait." Martha caught his arm, her grip surprisingly strong. "You can't face them alone. Tom tried that and it got him killed. The Taggarts don't fight fair. They use ambush tactics, superior numbers, and overwhelming firepower. A single man, no matter how skilled, can't survive against them. What are you suggesting?" Ezra asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. Martha was quiet for a long moment, her dark eyes studying his face as if trying to assess his character and resolve. "I'm suggesting we work together," she said finally. "You have something they want, and I have knowledge they don't know I possess. Combined, we might have a chance of surviving what's coming." The offer of partnership was both tempting and terrifying. Martha clearly understood the dangers they faced and had information that could prove invaluable in the coming conflict. But accepting her help would also make her a target, putting another person's life at risk for the sake of Muller's hidden treasure. "I can't ask you to take that kind of risk," Ezra said. "These men have already killed your husband. Getting involved with me would only paint a larger target on your back." "The target is already there," Martha replied firmly. "Tom died because he tried to stop them, but I've continued his work in ways they don't know about. I've been gathering information about their operations, tracking their movements, building a network of people who share intelligence about their activities." She paused, her voice taking on a steely resolve. "They're going to come for me eventually anyway, because I know too much about their operations. At least this way, I'll have a chance to strike back." The conversation continued for another hour, with Martha revealing the extent of her covert activities since her husband's death. She had been far from passive in her grief. She had built an intelligence network among the miners, ranchers, and storekeepers throughout the territory, all united by their shared hatred of the Taggart brothers and their determination to see justice done. "We have people in 6 different communities," she explained. "Folks who send word when strangers are asking the wrong kinds of questions, when unusual activity is observed, when the Taggarts or their associates are spotted. It's not enough to catch them. We don't have the official authority or firepower for that, but it's enough to provide early warning and coordinate defensive measures." The scope of her operation impressed Ezra and gave him hope that he might not be facing the coming storm alone. But it also revealed the full extent of the forces arrayed against them. The Taggart brothers were not simply a criminal gang, but the visible edge of a larger network of corruption and violence that reached into the highest levels of territorial government. As the evening wore on and plans began to take shape, Ezra found himself studying Martha's face in the lamplight, noting the determination in her eyes and the strength in her bearing. She was offering him more than just tactical support. She was offering partnership in the truest sense, a sharing of risks and responsibilities that went far beyond simple cooperation. The realization that he was no longer completely alone in facing the dangers ahead came as both relief and additional pressure. Martha's life would now depend on his decisions as much as his own, and the weight of that responsibility was almost overwhelming. But it was also liberating in ways he had not expected. For the first time since discovering Muller's treasure, he had someone he could trust completely. Someone who understood both the dangers and the stakes involved in the coming conflict. As they made their final preparations for what both knew would be a fight for survival, Ezra reflected on the strange turns his life had taken. He had come to the mountains seeking solitude and found instead the greatest treasure and the deadliest enemies of his life. He had bought an abandoned cabin seeking peace and discovered a war that had been waiting for him to join it. Most unexpectedly, he had found in Martha Caldwell not just an ally, but the possibility of something he had thought lost forever, a reason to fight, not just for survival but for the future they might build together if they lived through the trials. Ahead, the badge felt wrong in Ezra's hands the moment he picked it up. Marshal Tom Brennan had dropped it while examining Muller's mining tools, and something about its weight and texture seemed off. Ezra had handled enough genuine territorial badges during his Civil War service to know what authentic authority looked like, and this piece of tin and brass did not carry the proper markings. Under the lamplight of the cabin's main room, the deception became obvious. The engraving was too shallow, the metal too new, and most damning of all, the serial number had been filed away and replaced with crude hand-etching. This was not the badge of a territorial marshal, but a convincing fake designed to provide false legitimacy to a man who had no legal authority whatsoever. The discovery changed everything. Ezra thought he understood about his situation. Brennan was not a corrupt lawman working with the Taggart brothers. He was one of them, operating under a false identity to gather intelligence and position victims for assassination. The systematic nature of their operations was even more sophisticated than Martha had realized. The sound of approaching horses brought Ezra's examination to an abrupt halt. Through the cabin window, he could see a single rider approaching in the pre-dawn darkness, moving with the cautious urgency of someone carrying important news. The rider was Martha, and even from a distance, her posture suggested that something had gone terribly wrong. "Ezra," she called softly as she dismounted near the cabin door. "We need to talk. Something's happened that changes everything." She entered the cabin with the quick, efficient movements of someone operating under extreme stress. Her usually neat appearance was disheveled, and her dark eyes carried a haunted expression that suggested she had seen something that shattered her understanding of their situation. "Tom Brennan is dead," she said without preamble. "The real Tom Brennan, I mean. I found his body tonight, buried in a shallow grave about 2 miles from town. He's been dead for months, maybe longer." The news hit Ezra like a physical blow, confirming his worst suspicions about the man who had visited his cabin. "How did you find him?" "I couldn't sleep after our conversation," Martha explained. "Something about the timing of the Taggart brothers being in the area didn't feel right, so I decided to do some checking on recent territorial marshal assignments. My Tom, had kept detailed records about law enforcement personnel in the region." She paused, pulling out an official-looking document from her coat. According to territorial headquarters, Marshal Tom Brennan was assigned to investigate Heinrich Mueller's disappearance 3 years ago. But he never filed a final report, and he stopped communicating with his superiors about 6 months ago. When I read that, I knew something was wrong. "How did that lead you to the body?" Ezra asked. "My Tom had mentioned seeing a stranger's horse tied near Willow Creek on one of his final patrols," Martha continued. "He thought it was odd, because there's no good reason for anyone to be in that area. Tonight, I went to check the location, and I found where someone had tried to conceal a grave." The implications of her discovery were staggering. The man calling himself Marshal Brennan was not simply corrupt, but an imposter who had murdered the real lawman and taken his identity. The level of planning and execution required for such a deception suggested an organization far more sophisticated than a simple gang of claim jumpers. "There's more," Martha said, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "I found this in the real Brennan's coat pocket." She produced a leather notebook, its pages filled with careful handwriting. "It's his investigation notes about Heinrich Müller's case. And Ezra, he figured out who was responsible before they killed him." Ezra took the notebook and began reading by lamplight. Brennan's investigation had been thorough and methodical, tracking the movements of various suspicious characters in the weeks leading up to Müller's disappearance. But it was the final entries that revealed the true scope of the conspiracy. "The pattern is clear," Brennan had written. "The Taggart organization operates with inside information that can only come from territorial government sources. They know about successful claims before public records are filed. They're aware of law enforcement movements in advance, and they have access to official communications that should be secure." The notebook continued with Brennan's growing realization that the corruption reached into the highest levels of territorial administration. "Someone in Denver is feeding them information," he had concluded. "This is not a local criminal enterprise, but a territory-wide operation with political protection. Standard law enforcement approaches will be ineffective because the criminals know our plans before we make them." Brennan's final entry was dated just 3 days before his estimated time of death. "I have identified the source of the leak. Territorial Administrator James Hawthorne has been receiving payments from unknown sources and has access to all the information the Taggarts would need. I'm preparing to make arrests, but I fear my investigation has been discovered. If something happens to me, the evidence is hidden in my cabin under the floorboards near the fireplace." The revelation that territorial corruption reached the level of the administrator's office explained how the Taggart organization had remained successful for so long. They were not simply outlaws, but part of a larger criminal enterprise with official protection from the very government that should have been hunting them down. "We need to get that evidence," Martha said. If Brennan was right about the scope of the corruption, it might be the only way to expose the real criminals behind all this killing. "And if we're caught searching a dead marshal's cabin?" Ezra asked. "Then we'll be killed as certainly as if we do nothing," Martha replied. "The fake Brennan knows we're suspicious of him. He'll move against us soon, probably within days. Our only chance is to gather enough evidence to prove the truth before they can silence us permanently." The ride to the real Brennan's cabin took them through country that seemed increasingly hostile in the pre-dawn darkness. Every shadow could conceal an ambush. Every distant sound might signal the approach of enemies. But the evidence they sought was too important to abandon, even in the face of such dangers. Brennan's cabin was small and neat, the home of a careful man who took pride in order and detail. The floorboards near the fireplace were loose, exactly as his notebook had indicated, and beneath them was a metal box containing documents that revealed the full extent of the criminal conspiracy. Financial records showed payments from Denver to various territorial officials, including detailed accounts of bribes paid to ensure that certain mining claims were not properly protected by law enforcement. Correspondence between James Hawthorne and unknown parties discussed the systematic targeting of successful prospectors and the division of stolen wealth among the conspirators. Most damning of all was a detailed map showing the locations of planned future operations, including a notation about the Muller property and its new owner. The fake Brennan had been feeding information to his superiors about Ezra's activities, and the decision had already been made to eliminate him and seize whatever treasure he might have discovered. "They know everything," Martha said as she examined the documents. "Not just about you, but about our meetings, our conversations, probably even about tonight's activities. We're not investigating them, they're hunting us." The realization that they were already marked for death came as both terror and strange relief. The waiting and uncertainty were over. Now there was only the immediate need to survive and strike back. But the odds against them seemed impossible. A territorial administrator with virtually unlimited resources, a gang of professional killers, and a network of corruption that reached throughout the law enforcement community. "There is one advantage we have," Ezra said as he studied the financial records more carefully. "They think we're helpless victims like all the others. They don't know about Muller's treasure, and they don't know we've discovered their true identities." "What are you suggesting?" Martha asked. "I'm suggesting we give them what they expect to see," Ezra replied. "A frightened prospector with a small strike, trying to hide his discovery from claim jumpers. Let them think they understand our situation while we prepare for the real confrontation." The plan that began to form was audacious in its simplicity. Rather than trying to escape or hide from the Taggart organization, they would draw the killers into a trap, using Muller's treasure as bait. The fake Brennan expected to find a helpless victim. Instead, he would discover that Heinrich Müller's legacy included not just gold, but the means to destroy the criminal enterprise that had killed him. As dawn approached, and they prepared to return to their respective homes, Ezra felt the weight of destiny settling around his shoulders like a familiar coat. The gold in the well was real, but it was no longer the most important discovery on his property. Heinrich Müller had left behind something far more valuable than treasure. He had left behind the means to bring justice to the men who had murdered him and countless others. The question now was whether Ezra Stone and Martha Caldwell possessed the courage and cunning to complete what the German prospector had begun, or whether they would join the growing list of victims who had underestimated the deadly reach of territorial corruption and organized murder. The cavalry saber felt familiar in Ezra's hands. Despite the years that had passed since he last drew it in anger, the blade was still sharp, its steel unmarked by rust or neglect, and the weight of it brought back memories of battles fought in distant places for causes that seemed simple compared to the moral complexities he now faced. He had retrieved it from the wooden chest where it had lain wrapped in oiled cloth since his arrival in the mountains, along with his service revolver and the other tools of war. He had hoped never to need again. Martha watched him check the weapon's balance with the practiced efficiency of a man who had killed before and understood that he might need to kill again. Her own preparations were equally methodical, cleaning and loading the rifles they had gathered, organizing ammunition, and reviewing the defensive positions they had chosen for the coming confrontation. "You've done this before," she observed, noting the calm precision with which he examined each weapon and piece of equipment. "Different war, same principles," Ezra replied. "The enemy wants to kill you, and your job is to kill them first. Everything else is just details." The store that had been Martha's life for the past 3 years was now transformed into a fortress. They had barricaded the windows with planks and sacks of grain, created firing positions that offered clear views of all approaches, and stockpiled enough food and ammunition to withstand a siege of several days. More importantly, they had prepared the store to serve as the centerpiece of an elaborate trap designed to destroy the Taggart organization. Completely, the bait was irresistible. Word had been carefully spread throughout Cedar Falls that Ezra Stone had found Heinrich Müller's treasure and was planning to transport it to Denver within the week. Frank Gibson had been particularly helpful in spreading the rumor, his natural tendency toward gossip making him the perfect, unwitting accomplice in their deception. By now every person in the territory, who might have connections to the Taggart brothers, would know that a fortune in gold was waiting to be stolen from an isolated homesteader with minimal defenses, but the trap went far beyond simple military tactics. Hidden throughout the store were copies of the documents they had found in Marshal Brennan's cabin, placed where they would be discovered by anyone who searched the building thoroughly. If they did not survive the coming battle, at least the evidence of territorial corruption would be found by honest investigators who could continue the fight for justice. "Are you certain about this plan?" Martha asked as she checked the action on her husband's Winchester rifle. "Once we start, there's no turning back. Win or lose, our lives in this territory are finished." Ezra considered the question seriously. The plan they had developed was desperate and dangerous, requiring them to bet everything on their ability to outfight and outthink professional killers who had been successful for years. The odds against survival were sobering, but the alternative, living in constant fear while the Taggart organization continued murdering innocent people, was unacceptable. "Mellor tried to run and hide," Ezra said finally. "It got him killed and left his treasure buried where it couldn't do any good. I'd rather make a stand and at least give evil a fight worth remembering." The sound of approaching horses brought their conversation to an abrupt halt. Through a gap in the barricaded windows, they could see riders approaching Cedar Falls from the north, 5 men moving with the confident patience of predators who knew their prey was trapped. At their head rode the man they knew as the fake Marshal Brennan, his badge glinting in the morning sunlight like a mockery of legitimate authority. "They're coming," Martha whispered, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what they were about to face. Ezra positioned himself at the main firing position, where he could observe the street through a carefully concealed opening between grain sacks. His rifle was loaded and ready, with additional ammunition within easy reach, but he hoped the initial confrontation could be resolved without immediate violence. The longer they could maintain the deception that they were helpless victims, the better their chances of drawing the entire gang into the killing zone they had prepared. Brennan and his men dismounted in front of the store with the casual confidence of men who had done this many times before. They spread out in a practiced formation that covered all exits while Brennan approached the front door. His knock was polite, almost friendly, maintaining the pretense of legitimate law enforcement, even as his companions prepared for violence. "Mrs. Caldwell," Brennan called. "Marshal Brennan here. I need to speak with you about some information we've received regarding criminal activity in the area." Martha opened the door partially, keeping her rifle concealed behind the wooden frame while presenting an appearance of nervous cooperation. "Marshal," she said, her voice carrying just the right note of fearful respect, "what can I do for you?" "We've had reports that Ezra Stone may have discovered something valuable on his property," Brennan said, studying her face for any sign of deception. "Gold, possibly, or other mineral deposits that might attract the wrong kind of attention. We're concerned for his safety." The irony of the statement was breathtaking, the man responsible for planning Stone's murder expressing concern for his welfare. But Martha played her role perfectly, allowing worry and uncertainty to show in her expression while concealing the rage that burned beneath the surface. "Mr. Stone has been buying supplies," she admitted reluctantly. "More than usual for simple homesteading. But I assumed he was just preparing for winter. What kind of supplies?" Brennan pressed. "Anything that might suggest mining activities?" Martha hesitated, as if reluctant to betray a customer's confidence, then spoke with apparent reluctance. "Pickaxes, rope, lanterns. And he's been paying with unusually good coin. Silver that looks freshly minted rather than the worn pieces most folks carry." Brennan's eyes gleamed with satisfaction at the confirmation of what he had suspected. "Where is Mr. Stone now?" "We need to speak with him immediately about proper claim registration procedures. He went back to his cabin this morning," Martha replied. "Said he had work to finish before the weather turns." The conversation continued for several more minutes, with Brennan gathering details about Ezra's recent activities and apparent wealth, while maintaining the fiction that he was conducting a legitimate law enforcement investigation. But eventually, the false marshal seemed satisfied that he had learned everything Martha could tell him. "We'll ride out to the Stone property this afternoon," Brennan said. "Make sure everything is handled properly and legally. In the meantime, I'd appreciate it if you kept this conversation confidential. No need to alarm the community unnecessarily." After the riders had departed, Martha and Ezra began their final preparations for the battle they knew was coming. The afternoon would bring the Taggart brothers to the cabin, where they would discover that their intended victim had vanished, leaving behind carefully planted evidence suggesting he had fled with his treasure toward Denver. This would send them racing back toward Cedar Falls, where they expected to intercept their victim at the most logical place to obtain supplies for such a journey. "They'll come, hard and fast," Ezra predicted as he checked his weapons one final time. "Once they realize they've been deceived, they'll abandon any pretense of legal authority and come for us with everything they have." "Good," Martha replied grimly. "I'm tired of pretending to be afraid of them. It's time they learned what fear feels like." The hours of waiting that followed were among the longest of Ezra's life. Every sound from the street might signal the beginning of the final confrontation. Every shadow might conceal an enemy scout preparing for attack. But the waiting also gave him time to reflect on the strange turns his life had taken since Discovering Muller's treasure, he had come to the mountains, seeking solitude, and found instead the greatest challenge of his life. He had bought an abandoned cabin hoping for peace and discovered a war that had been waiting for him to join it. Most unexpectedly, he had found in Martha Caldwell not just an ally, but something he had thought lost forever. Reason to fight not just for survival, but for justice and the possibility of a future worth living. As the afternoon shadows lengthened and the time for action approached, Ezra felt the familiar calm that had carried him through the battles of his youth. Fear was still there, but it was controlled and channeled into the heightened awareness that would keep him alive in the minutes ahead. Beside him, Martha displayed the same steady resolve, her dark eyes fixed on the street where their enemies would soon appear. The sound of galloping horses announced the arrival of the moment they had been preparing for. Through the gap in their defenses, they could see 5 riders approaching at full speed, their formation tight and purposeful. At their head rode the fake Marshal Brennan, his face twisted with rage at having been deceived by people he had considered helpless victims. "Remember," Ezra said quietly as he took aim through the carefully prepared firing port, "we're not just fighting for our lives. We're fighting for everyone they've killed and everyone they'll kill if we fail." The final battle for Heinrich Muller's legacy was about to begin, and with it, the chance to bring justice to the men who had turned the Colorado Territory into their personal hunting ground for far too long. The explosion shattered the morning calm like thunder from a clear sky. Ezra had positioned Muller's hidden cache of dynamite beneath the store's front porch, rigged with a tripwire that would detonate when the Taggart brothers' horses reached the perfect position. The blast lifted 2 of the animals and their riders into the air, sending bodies and debris flying in all directions while the survivors fought to control their terrified mounts. In the chaos that followed, Ezra's military training took control of his actions. His first shot took down the fake Marshal Brennan as the man tried to draw his weapon while fighting his rearing horse. The bullet caught him in the chest, spinning him from the saddle to land in the dust of Cedar Falls' main street, with his badge of false authority glinting in the scattered sunlight. Martha's rifle spoke almost simultaneously. Her target, one of the brothers who had survived the explosion but was momentarily stunned by the blast. Her shot was clean and precise, taking the man through the head as he tried to orient himself to the source of the attack. Years of frontier living had made her an excellent marksman, and the steady hatred she felt for these killers made her deadly accurate. But the Taggart organization had not survived for years by being easily defeated. The remaining 3 men reacted to the ambush with the practiced efficiency of professional killers, abandoning their wounded mounts and diving for cover behind whatever obstacles they could find. Within seconds, they had established firing positions that allowed them to pour concentrated gunfire into the store while protecting themselves from return shots. Jacob Taggart, identifiable by the scar that ran from his ear to his jaw, had taken cover behind a water trough directly across from the store's main entrance. His voice carried clearly over the sound of gunfire as he shouted orders to his surviving brothers. "Samuel, get around to the back! Moses, cover the side windows. These bastards trapped us, but they're still outnumbered." The tactical situation was exactly what Ezra had expected, but still dangerous beyond measure. The surviving Taggart brothers were trying to surround the store, forcing him and Martha to defend multiple directions simultaneously, while the killers concentrated their fire on specific weak points in their defenses. It was a proven tactic that had worked for them many times before, but Ezra had planned for this contingency. As Samuel Taggart worked his way toward the store's rear entrance, he triggered the second explosive device that Ezra had positioned near the back door. The blast was smaller than the first, but no less effective, catching the younger brother in the open and hurling him against the store's back wall with lethal force. The death of his brother sent Jacob Taggart into a rage that made him careless. He rose from cover to pour rapid fire into the store's front windows, his shots splintering the wooden barricades and sending splinters flying in all directions. But his elevated position also made him a clear target for Martha, who had moved to a firing position that gave her a clean angle on his location. Her shot missed by inches. Close enough to send Jacob diving back behind the water trough, but not close enough to end the threat he represented. The near miss seemed to restore his tactical discipline, and he began firing with more careful aim at the specific points where he had seen muzzle flashes from their weapons. Moses Taggart, the largest and most brutal of the brothers, had managed to reach a position beside the store where he could fire through one of the side windows. His heavy rifle sent bullets crashing through their barricades with devastating effect, forcing both Ezra and Martha to retreat from their primary firing positions to avoid being hit by the deadly accurate fire. "We need to finish this quickly," Martha called to Ezra during a brief lull in the shooting. "If any of the townspeople decide to interfere, or if they have reinforcements coming, we'll be caught in a crossfire we can't survive." Ezra knew she was right. The longer the battle continued, the more likely it became that circumstances would turn against them. But the remaining Taggart brothers were experienced fighters who understood the value of patience and careful tactics. They would not expose themselves to unnecessary risk as long as they believed time was on their side. The solution came to Ezra in a flash of inspiration, born from his Civil War experience. Rather than waiting for the enemy to make a mistake, he would create a crisis that forced them to abandon their careful defensive positions. The third and largest cache of Mueller's dynamite was positioned beneath the store itself, rigged to be detonated manually if their situation became desperate. "Martha," he called softly, "when I give the signal, get to the root cellar and cover your head. I'm going to bring the whole building down on top of us." Her eyes widened as she understood what he was planning. The explosion would destroy the store that had been her life for 3 years, but it would also eliminate the covered positions that the Taggart brothers were using so effectively. In the open ground that remained, the battle would be decided by individual skill and courage, rather than tactical advantage. "Do it," she said without hesitation. "This place has been nothing but a target since Tom died. Better to see it destroyed fighting evil than to let it stand as a monument to their victory." Ezra made his way to the detonation point while Martha provided covering fire to keep the surviving brothers from realizing what was happening. The fuse was short, giving him perhaps 30 seconds to reach the safety of the root cellar before the explosion brought the entire structure down around them. As he lit the fuse and began his desperate sprint towards safety, Jacob Taggart seemed to sense that something significant was about to happen. The scarred killer rose from cover and poured rapid fire into the store, his bullets coming so close that Ezra could feel their passage through the air around him. The explosion, when it came, was larger than anything that had preceded it. The entire front of the store collapsed in a thunderous roar of splintering wood and falling debris, while the blast wave shattered windows throughout Cedar Falls and sent a column of smoke and dust rising into the morning sky like a signal fire visible for miles. In the ringing silence that followed, Ezra and Martha emerged from the root cellar to find themselves standing in the ruins of what had been their fortress. But the destruction had served its purpose. The water trough and other cover that the Taggart brothers had been using were buried under tons of debris, forcing the survivors into the open, where the final phase of the battle would be fought on equal terms. Through the smoke and settling dust, Jacob Taggart emerged like a specter of vengeance, his scarred face twisted with rage and his rifle leveled at Ezra's chest. Blood ran from a dozen cuts where flying debris had marked him. But his aim was steady, and his finger was tightening on the trigger when Martha's shot took him in the shoulder, spinning him around and sending his bullet wide. The impact staggered Taggart, but did not drop him. With the inhuman determination of a man who had killed too many times to count, he shifted his rifle to his left hand and continued firing even as his right arm hung useless at his side. His shots were less accurate now, but in the confined space of the ruined store, accuracy was less important than volume of fire. Ezra rolled behind the remains of a fallen beam and came up with his cavalry saber in his hand. The rifle was empty, and there was no time to reload, with Taggart advancing through the debris like an unstoppable force of destruction. The blade felt right in his grip, its familiar weight awakening muscle memories from battles fought in distant places against enemies who had been no less determined to kill him. Moses Taggart appeared through the smoke on Martha's flank, his massive frame moving with surprising speed for such a large man. He had lost his rifle in the explosion, but still carried a heavy revolver that he fired repeatedly as he charged toward her position among the scattered wreckage. Martha tried to bring her weapon to bear, but Moses was too close and moving too fast. The collision between them sent both fighters tumbling across the debris-strewn floor. Moses' size and strength gave him a significant advantage in close quarters, but Martha fought with the desperate fury of a woman who had already lost everything to these killers and refused to let them claim her life as well. Her husband's deputy badge, pressed against her chest throughout the battle, seemed to give her strength as she clawed and struck at the man who had helped murder him. Meanwhile, Jacob Taggart had closed the distance to Ezra, swinging his rifle like a club with his good arm while trying to draw a sidearm with his wounded hand. The confined space made sword work difficult, but Ezra's years of military training had taught him to adapt his techniques to whatever circumstances he faced. The saber's curved blade was designed for slashing attacks from horseback, but it could be just as deadly in close quarters when wielded with skill and determination. Taggart's first swing with the rifle butt missed Ezra's head by inches, the heavy wood splintering against the stone foundation wall behind him. Ezra's counterstrike opened a line of red across Taggart's chest, shallow but painful enough to make the killer stagger backward into a more defensive position. "You killed Heinrich Müller," Ezra said, advancing steadily as Taggart tried to create space between them. "And you've killed how many others?" "Innocent people who were just trying to make honest livings in hard country." "Müller was weak," Taggart snarled, finally managing to draw his revolver despite his wounded shoulder. "Just like you. Just like all the others who thought they could hide their gold from men like us." The shot came as Taggart brought the gun to bear, but Ezra was already moving, diving forward and under the line of fire, while bringing the saber up in a thrust that took the killer below the ribs. The blade sank deep, and Taggart's eyes widened with the surprise of a man who had never expected to die by steel after surviving so many gunfights. Across the ruined store, Martha's struggle with Moses Taggart had become a desperate battle for survival. The big man had pinned her beneath his weight and was trying to strangle her with his bare hands, his face contorted with the savage pleasure he took in killing. But Martha still had her husband's badge pressed against her chest, and the metal edge proved sharp enough to serve as an impromptu weapon. Drawing the badge with desperate strength, she drove its pointed star deep into Moses's throat, severing the arteries that carried blood to his brain. His grip loosened immediately, and his eyes grew wide with shock as he realized that his victim had become his executioner. The sudden silence that followed the end of the fighting was almost as shocking as the violence that had preceded it. Ezra stood among the ruins of Martha's store, his saber dripping with Jacob Taggart's blood, while Martha pulled herself from beneath Moses's lifeless body with shaking hands. Around them lay the debris of battle and the bodies of men who had terrorized the territory for years. But the victory had come at a price that went beyond physical destruction. Martha's store, her home and livelihood for 3 years, was reduced to rubble and smoking timbers. The careful life she had built after her husband's murder was gone, destroyed by the same forces that had taken everything else she had loved. "It's finished," Ezra said quietly, helping Martha to her feet and noting the cuts and bruises that marked her face and hands. "The Taggart brothers are dead, and the evidence we planted will expose the corruption that protected them." Martha nodded, but her expression was thoughtful rather than triumphant. "Tom's badge saved my life," she said, looking down at the bloodied star still clutched in her hand. He always said that sometimes justice requires good people to do terrible things, but that the badge reminded them to remain good people despite the terrible things they had to do. The sound of approaching horses brought both of them to full alert, their hands moving instinctively toward weapons despite their exhaustion. But the riders who emerged from the smoke were townspeople, led by Frank Gibson and several other men who had heard the explosions and come to investigate. "Mrs. Caldwell," Gibson called out, his voice carrying relief and amazement in equal measure. "Are you all right?" "We heard the shooting and thought—" He stopped as he saw the bodies scattered among the ruins, his face going pale as he recognized the men who had been terrorizing the territory. "These are the Taggart brothers," Martha explained, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had just fought for her life and won. "They came to kill Mr. Stone and myself, but they underestimated what they were facing." The next few hours passed in a blur of explanations and revelations as the townspeople examined the evidence that Ezra and Martha had gathered. The documents from Marshal Brennan's cabin revealed the full scope of the criminal conspiracy, while the bodies of the false lawmen provided physical proof of the deadly charade that had been played out in their community. But as the immediate crisis passed and the reality of their situation began to sink in, Ezra found himself studying Martha's face and wondering what would come next. They had survived the battle and exposed the corruption that had enabled it, but they had also destroyed everything that had anchored their lives to this place. The badge in Martha's hand caught the afternoon sunlight, its tarnished surface reflecting the light like a promise. They had honored the memory of her husband and Heinrich Müller, bringing justice to the men who had killed them. But justice, Ezra realized, was only the beginning of what they might build together in the days ahead. 6 months after the battle that destroyed Cedar Falls General Store, Ezra Stone stood in the doorway of the rebuilt cabin and watched Martha tend the small garden she had planted, where Heinrich Müller's well had once been. The well itself was sealed permanently now, filled with stones and earth, its deadly secret transformed into fertile ground where wildflowers bloomed among the vegetables. The simple gold band on Martha's finger caught the morning sunlight as she worked, fashioned from the last nugget Ezra had retrieved from Muller's treasure before sealing the well forever. It was not much to look at, a plain circle of mountain gold without adornment or inscription, but it represented something more valuable than all the wealth they had chosen to abandon. The decision to destroy the treasure had not been easy. For weeks after the battle, they had debated whether to extract Muller's gold and use it to build a new life elsewhere. The wealth was real and substantial, enough to ensure comfort and security for the rest of their days. But the blood that had been spilled for that gold, Muller's blood, Tom Caldwell's blood, the blood of countless other victims, had tainted it beyond redemption. Some fortunes cost too much to claim, Martha had said during one of their long conversations about the future. Heinrich found gold, but it destroyed his peace and ultimately killed him. I'd rather have a poor man's happiness than a rich man's fear, so they had sealed the well, planted the garden, and built their life on simpler foundations. Ezra had kept enough gold to purchase proper legal title to the land and make the improvements necessary for successful farming. But the rest remained buried where Muller had hidden it, a secret they would carry to their graves. The territorial investigation that followed their revelations had been swift and thorough. James Hawthorne, the corrupt administrator who had been feeding information to the Taggart brothers, was arrested and tried for conspiracy to commit murder. A dozen other officials throughout the territory were implicated by the evidence Martha and Ezra had gathered, leading to the largest corruption scandal in territorial history. But the most satisfying result had been the official recognition of Tom Caldwell's heroism and Martha's role in exposing the criminal conspiracy. The territorial governor had personally traveled to Cedar Falls to present Martha with a commendation for her courage, while Tom's name was added to the honor roll of lawmen who had died in service to justice. "The badge saved my life in more ways than one," Martha had told the governor during the ceremony. It reminded me that good people have a responsibility to stand up to evil, even when the odds seem impossible. Now, as Ezra watched his wife work in the garden they had created together, he reflected on the strange turns that had brought them to this moment of quiet contentment. He had come to the mountains seeking solitude and found instead the greatest love of his life. He had discovered treasure beyond imagination and chosen instead the wealth that could not be stolen or corrupted, the daily happiness of shared purpose and mutual devotion. The rebuilt cabin was larger than Muller's original structure, with proper windows that let in the mountain light and a stone foundation that would last for generations. Martha had insisted on a large kitchen where she could prepare meals for the travelers and neighbors who had begun visiting regularly, drawn by the stories of their heroic stand against the Taggart brothers. Their home had become an unofficial gathering place for the scattered homesteaders and miners of the region, a place where honest people could find hospitality and protection from the dangers that still lurked in the wild country. Word of their victory over the criminal organization had spread throughout the territory, and their reputation for courage and integrity drew those who needed help or simply wanted to be part of a community that stood for something good. "Ezra," Martha called from the garden, her voice carrying the contentment that had replaced the guarded caution of their early acquaintance. "Come see what's blooming where the well used to be." He walked over to where she knelt among the vegetables, noting the way the afternoon sunlight caught the silver in her dark hair and highlighted the laugh lines that had appeared around her eyes in the months since their wedding. Where the sealed well had been, a patch of wildflowers grew in profusion: Indian paintbrush, mountain lupine, and columbine, creating a natural bouquet more beautiful than any garden arrangement. "Heinrich would have liked this," Martha said softly, touching one of the delicate columbine blossoms. His gold grew into something beautiful, instead of just making more killing and sorrow. Ezra knelt beside her and took her hand, feeling the warmth of the simple ring he had made for her from Muller's last nugget. The metal had been cleaned of its bloody history and transformed into a symbol of hope and new beginnings, just as their lives had been transformed by choosing love over greed and justice over personal gain. In the distance, they could see riders approaching along the trail that led to their cabin. But the sight no longer brought fear or tension. Word of their identity and their victory had spread throughout the territory, and visitors now came seeking help and hospitality rather than bringing threats and violence. The riders proved to be a young family from the Eastern Territories, immigrants seeking good land and honest neighbors in the Colorado mountains. Ezra and Martha welcomed them with the same warmth they had shown to dozens of other travelers, offering food, shelter, and practical advice about surviving in the high country. As evening approached and their guests settled in for the night, Ezra and Martha sat together on the porch of their rebuilt home, watching the stars emerge in the clear mountain sky. The silence between them was comfortable and complete, the silence of two people who had found in each other everything they needed for happiness. "Do you ever regret it?" Martha asked quietly. "Giving up the gold, I mean. We could have been the richest people in 3 territories." Ezra considered the question seriously, as he always did when she asked it. The wealth they had abandoned was real and substantial, and there were moments when he wondered what their lives might have been like if they had chosen differently. But then he would look at Martha's face in the firelight, or watch her tend the garden that grew where deadly secrets had once been buried, and he knew with absolute certainty that they had made the right choice. "I found something better than gold," he said finally, taking her hand and feeling the ring that symbolized their union. Heinrich Müller spent years accumulating wealth, but he died alone and afraid. Tom Caldwell had a badge and a sense of duty, but he couldn't protect the people he loved. "We have each other and we have peace. That's treasure enough for any man." The future stretched ahead of them like an unwritten book, full of possibilities that went far beyond the simple accumulation of wealth. Their home would continue to grow as a center of community and hospitality. Their garden would flourish where secrets had once been buried, and their love would deepen with each passing season, proving that some fortunes were too valuable to be measured in gold. As the mountain nights settled around them and the stars wheeled overhead in their ancient patterns, Ezra Stone and Martha Caldwell sat together in the peace they had fought for and won. The sealed well beneath their garden held no more secrets, but the life they had built above it held promises that would last as long as love endured in a hard world that desperately needed examples of goodness, triumphing over evil. Sometimes they had learned the greatest treasure a person could find was the wisdom to know when they had enough.